Okay, let's get going for today. Alrighty, so I don't think there's anything too significant to sort of talk about in terms of details. I'm about a fifth of the way through the first mini labs. It's sort of my goal for this afternoon to get through and hopefully finish them and get them back to you today. I think I moved the date for the second one to I think October 1st, maybe. I think the Sunday after that, after like not this Sunday, but the following Sunday. So that is modified now on eClass, so that should be all good. I think, yeah, I mean, aside from that, we're just going to keep moving through talking about research ethics, and then going to go from there. Yeah.
Will the third mini lab also be on October 1st as well, or is that also pushed back?
I'll have to move that one as well. Yeah, because we're gonna do. I think there was a gap week in there somewhere. I think it was 1-2 gap, and then third one after. But I'd have to look at the schedule. I'll make sure to move it. It won't be due the same day, because we won't have covered surveys in time for you to do that. Right? We'll talk about them next week, and we should have it covered certainly by the Tuesday after next. We should have covered everything for surveys, but that's the topic for that mini lab. So yeah. Any other questions before I jump on in here? Semester already feels like it's going fast, but we're okay. I'm like, yeah, the midterm is soon. No, it's not. In every other class, it's soon, but this one's not till middle of October, so we still got some time. You're doing okay? All right. So last time, we were talking about kind of research ethics, right? So we went through a whole bunch of things, just kind of the basics of what it looks like to apply for research ethics, some of the things that research ethics boards are looking for, some of the things that might get you in trouble. And I was talking over with some of the other people in the department. We were talking about this and your lively questions and ethics. And one of them reminded me of something actually that I thought was interesting. I don't know if it's like super germane for our purposes, but I thought it was interesting. One of the things that people had tried to do in terms of inducements, right? So getting people to participate in research was lotteries. So basically, like, you'd be entered, you do the research and you're entered into a draw for a TV or $1,000 or something like that, right? Not necessarily that you'll win it, but that you'll be entered into a draw and one of the participants will win it. And some of the prizes were fairly large. And this at one point got shot down by research ethics boards as unethical because the things that people were potentially winning were too large. Apparently it's now back on the table, so it's kind of gone through this period where ethics boards were like, no, these lottery type systems are too much, and they're not fair. And now we've gone back, and apparently it's allowed again because the head of the Center for Criminological Research, Sandra Bucerius, was saying that she's done that in the last few years. These sort of, buy a prize, win a prize, sort of. You have a chance to win a prize, but you won't necessarily. So, that's another thing that you could think of as an inducement, right? A chance to win a prize, but then, sometimes a research ethics board might flip on that. So, okay. They're doing a seminar for the grad crim students on research ethics, and I was in my office, which has if you've ever seen my office, the wall doesn't go all the way to the top, so I could hear the whole conversation. And it basically was funny because all the stuff I told you, they were hearing as well. And I was like, all right, you're getting a graduate level education in ethics at an undergrad level, so that's good. Okay, yeah, so I guess we ended off on this slide, right? Or maybe we ended off on the one prior. Yes, okay, we did end off on the one prior, right? So we're talking about, informed consent. What does this look like? Practical challenges. how impractical informed consent, right? People choosing to participate in a study can be in certain forms of research. And this is something, the research ethics process was principally designed for kind of scientific studies, and it works really well for things like surveys. It's a little bit harder for ethnography, so that's something to keep in mind, right? It can contaminate, basically informed consent, can contaminate your subjects. There's unforeseen changes in the project, and unknown people can enter the research area, which makes it hard to get their consent, right? And again, I gave like if you're doing an observation in like a public space, something like a convention or something, right? It could be really difficult. And then in experimental research, right, reactive effects, if you tell people what you're looking for, it can ruin the experiment. But there's been a big kind of pushback on deception research. You have to have a really clear justification for doing it. And so, there's times where ethics constrains what we can do. Okay, and that is where we ended off last time. So, here, the concern for the welfare of people, right? Welfare, right? Concerned with the well-being of the people, the group or the community that you are studying, right? That's affected by the research. And the goal, right? Avoid harm. And harm, things like embarrassment, inadvertent identification of people. And this actually can be really hard, right? Like sometimes, I think I have it on another slide, pseudonyms might not be enough. So I'll just go forward for a second, right? Pseudonym, especially in like qualitative research, not identifying people can be really, really difficult, because if you write these kind of rich idiographic kind of accounts of things, the details that you might be offering might be, so specific that people that are part of a particular community would automatically know who that person is, even if you give them a pseudonym or a case number or anything, right? So doing kind of, these sorts of qualitative research and making sure your participants are not identified or harmed is tricky, and it's something that, depending on the degree of risk to the person if they are identified, it's something that you'd have to address as part of research ethics, right? Now there might be times that people just don't want to be identified, but it wouldn't necessarily harm them in particular to do these sorts of things, right? No problem, not a big deal. But there are times, right, if they're part of, say, a vulnerable community, the fact that they might be identified could be a problem. Now, again, the other thing that you might want to think about is the community that you're likely to be talking about going to read academic research, right? Not every, I think I remember when, I as part of one of my projects, the one on Russian TV, I did what's called a snowball sample, right? So basically, I lucked my way into interviewing a few people, and then I asked them for referrals to other people. And I remember one of the referral emails, sent from one person to another, and he's like, yeah, this guy's really cool. You should talk to this guy. He's doing a project on Russian TV. Maximum like 10 people are going to read this. Right, because it's an academic study, and I didn't feel good about myself after he said that, but it was kind of true, right? And that is something you want to think about, right? Is this going to be, is it going to end up in newspapers? If it does, different kind of set of ethics. If it's going to end up in an obscure academic journal that, frankly, no one outside of a very small community of researchers is ever going to read, that does mitigate a little bit some of this question, right? But yeah, in-depth research, analysis, and reporting could provide enough detail on people or locations that people could be identified. Changing identifiable information, even sometimes not identified, like if you're dealing with, street involved people in Edmonton, you'd want to be really careful about what kind of geographic information you offer, right? You might even want to be vague about the city that it took place in, right? A major city in Western Canada, that kind of thing. There's all sorts of ways that you want to make sure that people don't get identified if they're vulnerable, or if it could cause them harm. Okay, back to the slide before. Identity and privacy issues ensure the right to privacy, right? So people need to be able to choose what they want to disclose. They have a right to privacy. and just because even they've agreed to participate in your study doesn't waive that right to privacy necessarily. And confidentiality, basically any research where there's contact between the researcher and the subject, even online, you want to maintain sort of proper bounds of confidentiality. You want to let people know, in particular, when a conversation that you're having with them, if it's going to be on the record, right? You want to make sure that they know that, right? And you can do this easily by clarifying, right? Like, if you're concerned, you can ask them, okay, is that on the record, right? Are you like willing to disclose? Now, I mean, some populations might not know what that means. But I mean, I did ask this kind of question, people told me stuff. And I was like, hey, is that on the record? And they're like, actually, no, if you could, that one was off the record, right? And I mean, you don't want to bamboozle people either. Sometimes people speak, how shall we say, intemperately. And you wouldn't want them to have said something that they then regret and might harm them, even though it technically was on the record. You can ask them to clarify if they actually meant that in an off-the-record kind of way, right? One of the things with academic research, which might be different from, say, journalism, is that we're not interested in like gotcha quotes, right? Which a lot of times journalists will, not clarify whether something was on or off the record unless the subject actually says, hey, this is off the record. In academic research, I think we want to hold a higher standard of giving people the choice, right? So, I mean, there's also ways that you can talk about things that you were told off the record, right? You simply can't, it's an attribution thing. So you can't attribute something that you were told off the record to a specific person. You have to sort of hide who it was, what they were doing. So even the normal identifying information, like a pseudonym, you'd have to be like, a confidential source told me off the record, that this is the case, but then it has to be in such a way as no one could identify who that was, right? So anyway, confidentiality is super important, and you have to make sure that people know what's going to be attributed to them. Does that all make sense? Okay, probably pretty straightforward. Okay, we talked about this already. Covert research, another issue surrounding privacy and confidentiality in qualitative studies is covert research. So, covert research is kind of like deception research in a sense, where you are putting yourself in a situation where you would observe something. So a lot of ethnography would be covert. Participant observation is covert, right? In some cases. In other cases, you're like, sometimes in participant observation, you're like wearing a name tag that says researcher on it. In other cases, you might want to be covert, right? In the case where, and there's some research genuinely that you're not going to be able to do in an overt kind of way, right? Where doing the covert research might be the only kind of way that you're going to get good information, because simply your presence as a researcher is going to influence things way too much, right? Like people will act much differently under observation, right? So I know like people who've tried to do prison research, especially research on the behavior of correctional officers, often make the case that research needs to be covert, because the second a corrections officer knows that you're there observing, they are on their best behavior, and you get, basically no data that's usable, right? Just simply because they know that you're watching, and they're not going to act in the typical way that they might act towards their incarcerated people, right? So there is a place for covert research. It is exceptionally hard to get through research ethics. And there's been a real pushback on covert research, like deception research, right? Simply because, of this, there's no possibility of consent, right? You're in your furry suit at the furry convention, pretending to be a furry. You are living amongst the furries, right? It's very intrusive, right? Because you're right in there, you're interacting, you're actually pretending often to be something that you're not. I had seen one research study, and I don't know how this one got through ethics actually, where a person actually went through the recruitment process for the RCMP and went through depot, right? So they went to Regina, they went through all of the RCMP training so they could write a rich ethnography of what it's like to go through that process, right? Very intrusive, right? Because they were living, in close quarters with all of their fellow recruits, right? Seeing their foibles, going through all of the activities, while at the same time not disclosing who they were, right? So they never got consent. So the benefits have to outweigh the harm to participants, and you're going to find, if you ever try to do this, that it's going to be quite difficult to get this through a research ethics board. They're going to push back, and there's going to be lots of moments where they send stuff back for clarifications. They might turn it down. You might have to appeal it, right? Obviously one of the big benefits, no reactivity. People are going to be acting naturally if they do not know that you are acting in this capacity. So they're going to act normally. Permission from the participants to use the data may be sought after the fact if they are available. And again, this is a fraught process, and depending on how intrusive the research is, this could actually be really, really difficult, right? Because if you were, living at depot with a bunch of RCMP officers and you come back later and say, hey, actually, I was just here to research all of you, you could get some very negative reactions, right? So it's something to keep in mind. It can happen this basically the same principle as in deception research where you have to debrief. This is debriefing, but it can be really hard to get. And sometimes, maybe say depot is a bad example, but say a convention, it may not be possible to get consent afterwards because you don't know who people were, right? They were in a mass kind of public space and you don't have, say, contact information for them and no way of getting it. And researchers, you have to ensure the anonymity of non-consenting participants. And again, the problem here being that even in identifying, in richly describing what was happening, I see your hand, you might be describing it in such a way as someone could figure out who it was. Like if you're like, I did depot training from, September 2019 to, I don't know, when it's like 6 months, right? So 6 months after that. And you identify the time period. Well, everybody who was there at that time could figure out, anyone who has access to the records could figure out who you're talking about. Yeah, please.
So what would happen if you kind of just did the research anyways without asking the ethics board? Would you go to jail?
Academic jail. You could, a couple of things could happen, right? You would be sanctioned by the university, which could, let's say you're a graduate student. If you're a professor, you could be fired, right? That would be grounds actually even for revoking tenure, like non-ethical research, definitely grounds for revoking tenure. As a graduate student, you could be kicked out of the university. Degrees could be withdrawn that you've earned, right? So the university could say oh, hey, you earned your master's degree, but we found out later that you did this research in an unethical way. We're actually withdrawing your degree, right? So if you ever applied somewhere else and you had to provide transcripts, it would say, degree revoked, which is bad. That doesn't go well if you ever want to do anything else. So, the consequences are not criminal typically, unless you've actually harmed someone in a way that could be charged by police. Yeah, please.
If you want to do your research without going through a university or institution, then you don't have to go through the ethics board.
It will depend on where you're doing it. So, like I said, governments have their own ethics processes, right? So if you're doing it through, say, Alberta, the government of Alberta, or Alberta government agency, it's going to have its own ethics board internally. Like I said, a friend of mine does it at Alberta Innovates Health Solutions. They have their own ethics kind of process that's internal to the government. Private companies sometimes do and sometimes don't have ethics processes, and research institutes sometimes do and sometimes don't. It's going to depend. In that case, because you're not, I guess if you're working for a company and they have a process, they could fire you, right? They could terminate your employment. If you're, at a research institute, I guess the same thing, and you're doing unethical research, you could be terminated from that position. But that's about the extent, unless you've done something that's actually criminal, right? In which case, I mean, I don't imagine, I don't know what kind of research you're contemplating doing. It's like, uh, selling drugs on the street, clearly unethical. And then, yes, you could face criminal charges. I want to see how people do when they're high on meth. So I'm just going to give these people meth, Well, then you would, of course, be, possession with intent to distribute it. You might be liable for criminal charges. Also, that would be unethical, right? Because, I don't know, meth is bad, I think, probably. Does that make sense? Okay.
So do you need to get permission, after you get the data, or is that just a good practice?
I think it's going to depend on the circumstances. I would think where you can get consent for data, it's better because then you don't face sort of an ethical quandary about using it. But you do risk your data, right? Because the second you start asking people who were deceived whether you can use their data, there's a really good chance that they're going to say no, right? And then you may have done this, and this is why it's so fraught, right? You may have done a bunch of research, and Tom, the guy that you were at RCMP training with, is like, you know what? I don't want you to talk about me at all. And you had some great information about how he reacted to stuff, and he says, I don't want that included. You'd have to take all of that out, right? And so it's a quandary, right? Because you could have done a bunch of research and everybody says no. And then you spent 6 months there for no reason, right? Does that make sense? Like you put your data at risk by seeking consent, right? Because anybody could say no, and then you have to pull all of their data out, basically. And you can't just keep it, you have to destroy it, right? Like it's not like, oh, I'll just talk about it in an abstruse way, right? If you're going to be truly an ethical researcher, from a research ethics perspective, maybe not a human perspective, who knows, you'd have to get rid of that data. You can't just keep it in your back pocket, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Other ethical quandaries. Okay. Okay. Duty to report. Like any, and this is especially true when you're dealing with vulnerable populations, right? Or anything where there's disclosures of harm especially to a vulnerable person, whether or not it undermines the integrity of your research. There are certain things that you have to report to law enforcement, basically, as part of your research. And this is something actually, Kevin Haggerty has some interesting stories about this. People they're interviewing, asking him if they can put a gun in the trunk of his car to hide it just for a little while and stuff like this, things that you have, criminal research is like, criminology is super interesting for this. But I think principally if say you're doing even research with incarcerated people, right? And you're asking about, the family of the incarcerated person, and they have children, and you find out in the course of the interview that, they're the mother of those children who has custody, abuses them or neglects them in some way. That might really harm your relationship with the person that you were interviewing, right? If you're hoping to do, say, follow-up interviews or anything like that, might put that at great risk. But regardless of that, you have a duty to report, right? Under every circumstance, abuse, sexual abuse, crime, not necessarily past crime, right? So if someone tells you that they committed a crime, like they were selling drugs somewhere and they never got caught, you don't necessarily have a duty to report that, especially if they're already incarcerated. However, if they tell you about something more serious, like a murder they committed, then you definitely would have to report that, right? Something that they were never charged with, you'd have to report that. You can't keep that in your back pocket. And any future intention of committing a crime that's particularly specific, right? So here, you're almost like a lawyer, so despite in the law, despite the fact that as a lawyer you have attorney-client privilege, right? And anything that your client tells you is privileged and you can't disclose that. if they tell you that they are planning to commit a crime, you actually have a duty to report, both in the law and research ethics, right? So if there's something that, and especially if there is some sense that your reporting it could stop it from occurring, right, you have to disclose that. You can't keep that a secret. You have an ethical duty to report it, right? So if they're gonna, you're doing gang research and they tell you that they're gonna, that's all crime here for me. They're gonna go and they're gonna, basically take a bunch of guns and go attack another gang. You'd finish that interview and you would immediately go to the police. Yeah.
But would you be concerned for your own safety if you ratted on a gang?
That is a potential thing, and this is likely going to come up in your ethics, where your ethics board is going to ask you, are you going to be safe doing this research, right? And that's always fraught too, because you have to worry about your own safety, and a research ethics board will often ask, are you going to die in the course of doing this research? Well, maybe not that exact question, but are you safe? Are you putting yourself in jeopardy, and is it worth it? But yeah, even if it puts you at risk, right? Even a lawyer who is, the lawyer for a gang has to report if they know that that gang member is going to commit a crime, right? Or, in the case of the law, they could be disbarred. But you do have a duty to report, and especially anything that has to do with children, child abuse, child neglect, these sorts of things, you have to report it to the police and let the police decide what to do with it. So yeah, it's fraught, and it could put you in danger, and it could put your research in danger. So it's all stuff that you have to do, but you can't just, for fear of your own safety, allow someone else to remain in harm's way, right? Okay. Yeah, the privacy and confidentiality rules are often used to set boundaries on what can be disclosed to a researcher and what will result in a report to an outside agency. The university has a pretty clear rule book on this, right? And the Research Ethics Board has this rule book as well. And if you're ever in question, you could ask your immediate supervisor, or you could ask the Research Ethics Board. So someone tells you, a crime that they're going to commit, there's always a step you would go probably if you're a tenured faculty, you'd go to the chair of your department and be like, hey, someone just told me this, what do I do? And they're likely going to refer you possibly to university lawyers, the Research Ethics Board, to figure out what your duty is. So it's not something where you have to make these ad hoc judgments. There's processes in place to figure that out too. And obviously if someone asks you to commit a crime, don't do that. Don't participate in crime, right? You don't want to be an accessory to crime. And I've been assured by criminologists that if you do criminal research for long enough, someone will ask you in some way to participate in the crime, right? They're going to ask you to hide a gun. They're going to, they're going to ask you, could you just hold on to this backpack for me for a few hours? I swear, ask any of the people who do research that involves, people who commit crimes, and they've been asked to commit a crime, right, essentially, or be accessory to a crime, or turn a blind eye to something clearly criminal in some way. So you have to, criminology is particularly fraught. Other parts of sociology might not be as fraught, but you might find out all sorts of things, right? You might end up just hearing casually someone mention something that leads you to believe that they might be abusing or neglecting children, right? And you do have to report all of that stuff. Okay. Yeah, if you think you're in this circumstance, right, you should disclose this, right? This could be part of your information and consent letter, right? So if you're, doing interviews with a vulnerable population or a population you think might commit crimes, you should tell them hey, I don't know if you've ever, been to therapy, but they'll tell you stuff hey, if you report that, there's a child being harmed, right, that you're abusing a child, I have to tell the police, right? Or if you're going to harm yourself or someone else, right, if you tell me you're going to go on a shooting spree, I have to, inform the police, right? This is a front-loaded thing. You can put that in your information and consent letter. It's included in informed consent. So you should be upfront about it in some way if you think you're going to be in a situation where that's possible. Now, obviously, there's a lot of situations where you wouldn't have to include that, right? If you're doing research on, Russian TV, I never included that because it just was never going to be a field that I ventured into, right? But, other fields like criminology, clearly that is. Ethics board review and approval is required, right? In your informed consent, It's in there, right? In your consent letter. And your consent letter is something you have to, that goes into your ethics package, right? It's all in there, and they have to review all of that stuff. All good. I know. I make research sound much more fun than it might actually be. It's like, someone will ask you to hide a gun. Only if you're a criminologist. Okay. Online analysis. Yeah, okay. So, it's a kind of a fraught field, right? There's, so online data collection and analysis is growing in a lot of fields, right? Because people put so damned much information online. So, because it involves human subjects, typically you will have to get some kind of research ethics board approval, or you could find yourself in trouble. Couple of things, right? These are actually much more fungible. These are presented here as kind of hard and fast rules. I've seen studies where this is bent, right? Or actually completely disregarded. So different kind of research ethics boards and different fields might feel differently about this, right? Don't join a chat room, pretend to be a participant of the group, and do not conduct covert research online. Now the thing is, there's a really fraught kind of thing with research ethics. It's on and online stuff, where it's like, is there any kind of expectation of privacy when you're posting something, say, online, right? On social media, on like fan boards or like chat boards or something like that. Is there any sense in which, or Facebook groups or something like that, is there any actual expectation of privacy? Or can researchers just enter those spaces and just cull as much data as they possibly can for their own uses? Kind of the consensus is that anything that people post in presumably publicly available spaces, you can probably use without too much ethical qualms, because they've sort of given up their expectation of privacy. If the group is like a private group that you sort of sneak your way into, that's a different story. Yeah, please.
Are you able to like go into one of these chat rooms and just like not say anything, but just kind of observe, kind of like take an observational kind of perspective, but on an online chat room?
So that would be covert research in a sense. I think yes. I think the answer to that clearly is yes, as long as it's a relatively public group, right? So if it's like, I don't know, the neighbors of Mill Woods, right? Like a Mill Woods chat group where people talk about problems in the community, I would think that that's okay, because I don't think anyone's expecting anything they say in that space to be private. If you were, I don't know, going into like an online victim support group that maybe you have to apply to get into, even if there's not much of a vetting process, people might feel like that's a more private space. And then I would think there's more of a problem with that kind of space. So it would be highly contextual, depending on what kind of activity people are putting online, what their expectation of, is this going to remain somewhat private? We have the same mug, which is funny. I don't know why, but it's over. What's that?
Love that.
Yeah. But yeah, does that make sense? Like it's going to be highly contextual, which is why before you do it, I would advise getting that research ethics board approval, just in case. Like even if you're doing like Instagram posts, right? It doesn't hurt to apply for it and say what the research ethics board says, because they might have some insight into like the deep rules of ethics that you haven't considered. Because yeah, I mean, especially once you get into that, and like, what are the bounds of this? Like, could you reproduce, say, the posts that people have put online as part of your written research, right? Could you take people's Instagram photos or the Instagram posts and take screenshots of them? It's technically in public, right? It's all I guess if you have access to it, it's probably public. Could you do that? I think probably yes, but it wouldn't hurt to ask what an ethics board. And it might depend on what you're looking at too, right? Like if you're going to be talking about like Instagram and body image, and you're planning on reproducing, images of people you think have unhealthy body image, Well, if they find out about it later, that could really harm them, right? And so an ethics board might have something to say about that. But it's a good question. I think online remains a really chaotic space to do research in because nobody really knows what the rules are, which we should, right? The internet has now been a thing for, 30 years, but I think we're still kind of unsure how to work these things. Good. Sorry, I wasn't sure if your hand was halfway up, but no, you're just flexing. Cool. Yeah, I mean, consider encryption for any information that can be connected to the internet, right? So, I mean, this is a kind of recommendation that if you have something on your laptop that's research data and potentially something could be hacked, right, or leaked, someone could break into your computer, you might want to encrypt it on a drive, right? Keep it separate. Very few people actually do this because it's a pain in the ass. Sorry, bad language. Encryption is a real pain because then you have to decrypt stuff to work with it. But, and I think even reasonable, password protection with, two-factor authentication, not the one that sends a text message to your phone, the ones that are like specific to like biometrics would be better. But stuff that would keep it separate so that only you can access it would be, and that there's a really high barrier for you to get into it would be really good, right? Because some of the data you collect, if your computer's connected to the internet, could potentially be accessed by someone else through some method. Okay. Okay, justice. So this is obviously one of the other principles, right? In practice, right, potential harm should outweigh potential benefits, right? Should not, sorry, should, fuck. You should definitely harm your participants more than they benefit. No, wrong, I said that wrong. I need more caffeine. It should not outweigh the potential. Sorry, the harm, potential harm, basically you shouldn't harm them more than potentially benefiting them, right? It would be bad. And generally avoiding harm as much as possible is the best approach. Their life shouldn't get worse because of participation in the research project, right? So if there's the risk that, somehow they're going to be impacted, someone's going to find out they participated, if you're doing prison research and someone finds out they participated and told prison secrets that got out and then the COs read about it, right? And maybe they are, put in danger. That's a definite consideration you should have, right? You should not make their life worse. And yeah, if the potential harm and risks are greater than the risks of everyday life, then informed consent is the minimum requirement, right? So you have to, there's a whole section in the consent letter on risk, and you have to really think that through and be really, really clear about it. Okay. Sorry, that was the last slide for this section. How are you? Everything there good? All right, are we really ready to talk about quantitative research? Okay. Switching slideshows now. Okay, quantitative research. Launch. All right, so quantitative research entails what? Certain epistemological and ontological assumptions, right? So amongst other things, epistemologically, it tends to be positivist, right? To think that you can't, the world is something that you can sort of measure and quantify, which is why we call it quantitative research. And ontologically, right, we tend to believe that there is an objective world out there when we're doing quantitative research that you can actually measure, right? It's not just interpretations on interpretations, right? Quantitative, right? It's all about quantities, right? It's mathematical, all that fun stuff. Collection of numerical data, right? So you're trying to put things into measurable quantities that you can compare to other things, right? But it has to be measurable in some way, shape, or form. And so, there's a lot of different methods of quantitative research. The most common one in sociology is survey and questionnaire research, which we're going to talk extensively about. But there's other things like certain forms of content analysis. If you're looking at newspapers and these sorts of things, magazines, or even journals and such, you can do a sort of quantitative content analysis. It's boring, but it's doable, right? Like there are people who've done research looking at like, going back through newspaper archives in something like LexisNexis where it's searchable. And searching like how many times was the word indigenous used in newspaper articles in Canada between the years blah and blah. That kind of research slightly makes me want to never do research again because it's boring, but you can do like content analysis, right? So it's not just surveys, that's what I'm saying. Typically you have a deductive kind of relationship between your theory and your research, right? So typically you're starting with a theory, you get your research question, you compose your hypothesis, you collect data, which you then test, right? And if necessary, then you revise the hypothesis, right? But it's, theory, hypothesis, data, analysis to prove that hypothesis right or wrong. Okay. The preference for natural science approach, right? This sort of positivist and an objective conception of social reality. The major concern is measurement validity. Are you measuring what you are intending to measure, right? This all comes down to basically operationalization. Okay, so there are important steps to follow when conducting quantitative research, right? So this figure here that we've got is helpful for understanding the steps, right? And it's not, I don't want to say it's like a hard and fast kind of rule, right? Sometimes this might look a little different, but all of these steps should more or less be present, right? So you start with theory, you go to your hypothesis, like I was saying, you design your research, devise your measures of concept. So how are you going to measure what you're trying to measure? Figure out where you're going to do the study. Select your participants. So that's our sampling method. Administer research instruments, right? So collect your data, process it, analyze it, write your findings do your findings and conclusion, and write up, what you found, right? So basically, that is the process more or less, and that's there for your use. Okay, operationalization. I know I've been hinting at this. I've been giving you the trailer on operationalization for a while. Basically, operationalization is the process of converting concepts into indicators or specific questions in a questionnaire or an interview, right? So basically creating a measurement tool or tools for a specific kind of concept. And it sounds simple. It can be very, very difficult, right? Okay. So for a research question like this, right? And this I've kind of created this myself. Is secularization a decline in religious belief increasing from generation to generation, right? So you have a concept, right? Secularization. You need questions that allow you to measure the phenomenon you're trying to study, right? So to operationalize it, what kind of questions are you going to ask to measure the phenomenon you're studying? So in this case, how would you measure, say, secularization or religiosity, right? How would you measure that? What kind of questions could you ask? And so here you can ask, like, what behaviors do people undertake that speaks to their religiosity or lack of religiosity? Okay, and I say this, religiosity is a good one because we have a really long track record in sociology of how we measure things like religiosity, right? So we have a pretty established tool set. Okay, so the most obvious question would be to ask for people's religious self-identification, right? So if you're talking about secularization and you want to measure, are different generational cohorts either more or less religious, right? You could ask something like this, right? How religious do you consider yourself to be? And then you would have, this is what's called, I'll talk about Likert scales in a minute, but this would be a kind of Likert scale, right? So basically going from one pole to another, right? Very religious to very irreligious, right? Or very religious or not religious at all. Okay, so that would be one way, right? And that's a pretty straight up, easy measurement of religious self-identification. That's one pole. Do you consider yourself, you could have a two-part question, right? Do do you consider yourself a member of a religious group? Yes or no. And if you say, if someone answers yes, you then track them into here, right? You could also ask, right, how do you identify religiously? And you could have all of these, right? And no religion or nothing in particular as one of the options, right? And that's a pretty standard tool. If you look at, say, the General Social Survey from National Opinion Research Center at University of Chicago, which has been running, the GSS since 1972 or something like that. I can't remember if it's 72 or 76. This is the kind of question they ask on religiosity. This is also kind of the question you would see on the Canadian census, right? So right there, you're turning a sort of question about religious identity into something that's easily measurable, right? You're going to get a value, X number of your participants are going to say this, and the other thing. Okay, so that's pretty easy. Self-identification, though, isn't always the best measure of, say, an activity, right? Many millennials identify as nothing in particular, and it might not tell the whole, but that might not even tell their whole story, right? So you might want to ask yourself about behaviors that are undertaken by religious people, or if you're thinking about another question, right? If you're thinking about a different group, you want to think about what kind of things that group does that you can measure, right? So in the case of religion, right, things like religious service attendance would be a measure, right? How religious are people? Are there generational differences? Well, how often do they attend religious services? Right, and you see this like in Pew Research's samples, they ask this question. Prayer or communing with the supernatural, right? How often do they do that? Interacting with sacred texts, how often do they read sacred texts? Other things like how important would they rate religion as part of their lives, right? Is it very important? Like you could identify as, say, a Roman Catholic, but say that, religion is not very important in your life. All sorts of things like that, right? So behaviors and attitudes, right, are things that you could ask about as well. And that's, again, just an example for the idea of religiosity, right? So you would have, this is like the typical religious service question. How often do you attend religious services? And I'm sorry, all the religion talk is because especially if you're in 376 with me also, I'm like the sociology of religion nerd. So I love this stuff and I know it super well. But yeah, how often do you attend religious services? And always, this one is always the caveat that you want to put in there, not including weddings or funerals, because, at a certain age, people attend a lot of weddings, so they might include that, and that would skew your data. And at another point in life, people attend a lot of funerals, and that could skew your data as well. Okay, so what would you get, right? So, I don't know if daily, sometimes I see daily, usually it's more than once a week or weekly plus, weekly, several times a month, monthly, a few times a year, or never, right? That would be your sort of typical measure, or sometimes seldom. Instead of a few times a year, you put seldom or never, right? And that would be a way of measuring, how often people are actually attending religious services, right? Similar with prayer, right? You could have how often do people pray? Several times a day, daily, weekly, several times a month, monthly, seldom, or a few times a year, or never, right? All ways of taking that concept of how religious is a person and putting it into something that's measurable, right? Something where you're getting a look at their behaviors and you could actually create a quantity that tells you something. Same thing with, reading sacred text, that sort of thing. Okay. How does that strike you? Does that kind of make sense? This is actually really hard. And even now, as I've been looking through research questions, there are some potential stumbling blocks, which I'll point out to you, so don't worry about it. There are some potential stumbling blocks where some things may actually be really difficult to operationalize. Even like sometimes people have this, the one that I always found drove me crazy in past years, and I think I banned it in past years because it was driving me too crazy, was like during COVID, people, I want to measure this phenomenon during COVID, but how you operationalize during COVID was actually much more difficult than you thought. And some of the things were like, you would be relying on people's memories of something that happened during this and this period, and people may have imperfect memories. But I might point out, sometimes I have this criticism of a survey we're doing right now in criminology, which is like 6 months before you were incarcerated, did you do this? And I'm like, Okay, are people going to remember that specifically? I don't know. But anyway, I have qualms. I also have a group of friends who are survey nerds, and we criticize other people's surveys for fun. So I did that to my boss. I showed it to my extremely nerdy survey friends, and they were like, "This is a terrible survey," and I'm like, should I reveal that to my boss? Maybe not. Okay. But yeah, just be careful when you're operationalizing stuff, and when you get look at the research question, I might be like, this variable is going to be really hard to operationalize. So that can be kind of a big problem. Okay. I hate during COVID. Like during COVID, I know we're all obsessed with COVID because it traumatized us all, but it's a really tough one because what was the period of COVID? When did it end? What are your bounds? Is it still going on? I don't know. Okay. So concepts. So concepts, right, are things that, basically ideas or mental representations of things, right? Something that you might want to talk about, right? There's and there's a bunch of them, right? Emotional labor, secularization, hyperactivity, academic achievement, teacher expectations, leadership, crime, research ethics, drug and alcohol use, self-image. These are all kind of ideas, right? Like concepts or mental representations of things that are happening out in the world. And so the goal of operationalization is to turn, something like loneliness, right? Something like emotional labor or loneliness into something that you can actually measure. It might be your dependent or independent variable, right? When you're looking at survey research, it might be the thing that you think is affected by another factor, whether it's age, gender, or whatever, right? Race. That you might be looking at loneliness. Is loneliness affected by the race of the person, right? That would be loneliness would be your dependent variable. In other cases, you might be thinking does loneliness affect X, right? Academic achievement, where someone's score on a loneliness index would be your independent variable, and your dependent variable would be academic achievement, right? So concepts can be either your independent or dependent variables. When we're talking about statistics, right, independent are manipulated to see if they have an impact on dependent variables, and this is all done through fancy schmancy statistical devices and all that fun stuff. Think dependent is the outcome, independent is the manipulated variable, or the thing that you're measuring to see if it is this in this state, right? If the answer is, are you male or female? They say male. Well, then what is the effect of that on, say, loneliness? Okay. Does that all make sense? Okay. Yeah, so the goal with quantitative research is to measure things, right? Why? Because it allows you to see the fine or small differences between people or issues that you're interested in. Gauge those differences with consistency, right? So to see between different cases, you can go on a population level or on an individual subject level once you have your data, and you can gauge kind of changes in those variables or those differences, in big cases or small cases. It allows you to estimate the relationship, right? The correlation, never the causation, between concepts and the strength of the relationship, right? How correlated is it, right? How correlated is academic achievement with race? How correlated is loneliness with age, right? It's in measuring those things that you can get those kind of really fine gradients. Sorry. Okay. Oof. So you're going to have to do this for your lab, and you're going to have to do this in the major, the mini labs and the major labs, right? And basically, when you're thinking of a variable, right, you're going to have to provide both operational and nominal definitions of them. Okay, so there's two basic types, right, of definitions for concepts. Nominal, right? So describes the concept in words much like a dictionary definition, right? So that would be, say political party identification refers to the party to which people most closely associate themselves with. Are you a Democrat or a Republican or an independent? Are you conservative? Do you support the conservatives, the liberals, the NDP? Okay, so this is an interesting one. political party identification in Canada is almost always measured in the following way. And it's like, in the last federal election, which party did you vote for, if you voted for any? Or in the last provincial election, which political party did you vote for, if any? Right? That's almost always how in Canada we gauge political party affiliation, because very few people actually, you don't register as a conservative or a liberal, right? In the US, it's like, are you a registered member of Republican or registered Republican voter, Democratic voter, or independent voter, right? Where it's a slightly different thing. Okay, sorry. But yeah, which political party identification, right? So if you're wanting to be like, does political party identification affect X, right? You would define it nominally as, basically the party to which one most closely associates themselves. Operational, right? Your operational definition describes how the concept is going to be measured, right? So here, right, do you not normally think of yourself as a supporter of the Conservative, Liberal, New Democrat, Greens, or Bloc Québécois, right? That could be a way of measuring it. And for religiosity, right? If you're wanting to measure religiosity, right, your operational definition would be, frequency of, let's say, you say self-identification as part of a religious group, and prevalence of religious behaviors, right? So you would measure those, and you would sublist them, right? Religious service attendance, prayer, and subjective importance of religion to their lives, right? So basically, in nominal definition, you're like, political party. This is what I mean by political party identification. This is like the normal speech kind of way of defining it. And operational is like, how are you going to measure it, right? What is it that you're going to measure here when you actually go to measure it? Okay, sorry, does that make sense? Yes. It's much harder than, maybe it'll be easy for you. It's much harder than it sounds in some ways, right? Because especially when you're thinking of how to do this for your own kind of proposals, it can be, difficult. Now, okay, helpful tip. Something I'll mention to you. I'll mention it to Celine again when you're doing your kind of practice doing survey questions, that she can bring it up. I'm going to not advise that you plagiarize, but I'm going to advise that you plagiarize. So here's what I mean. In a lot of cases, the best way of approaching operationalization of a concept is potentially to see how someone else has approached that same concept in the past, right? So one of the things that I frequently see, and I think I've taught, this is my 5th or 6th time teaching this course, right? So I've seen a lot of people's proposals or major labs. One of the things that I frequently see is people essentially trying to invent their own measure for something like loneliness, something like religiosity, something like, I'm trying to think, there's a lot of them. Like even ADHD, someone wants to see the effect of ADHD on XYZ, and they'll ask really quick, I don't know, this is silly, potentially not well formulated questions like, do you have ADHD? Or have you ever been diagnosed with ADHD? What I think you should do, and I'm fully advising that you do it and then tell me you did it, and A+ for you, is to go and look up tool sets that people have created, right? For instance, if you are thinking about talking about loneliness, don't try to come up with your own questions about loneliness. Go look at something like the UCLA Loneliness Index, right? It is a tool that is used commonly by researchers in measuring loneliness. If you want to kind of, potentially figure out if the people you're talking to have something like ADHD, right? I think it's a test, basically, it's used by psychologists called the SNAP-4, right? Which you could go and you could take some set of those questions that they ask and reuse them, right? Because I stress, reinventing the wheel leads to mistakes, right? Because I would say lovingly, being inexperienced, you will write some really silly questions, right? Phrased in really silly ways. So I'm trying to guide you off of that road, the road of silly questions, to something a little bit more refined, which is, and you can say, like, your operational definition. loneliness is going to be measured using UCLA's loneliness index, right? Or the prevalence of ADHD in a subject is going to be measured using the SNAP for assessment tool, right? Or religiosity. I don't know that there's a specific tool for that one, but if you're talking about like body image, right? There are body image kind of tools that you would use in surveys. Eating disorders, right? All of these things have defined kind of measurement tools that you could use in doing surveys. I don't know. I know the UCLA one for, I don't know, just because it's often talked about in religious research, but there are a million tools out there and you can find them using Google, right? So just be like, assessment tools for measuring ADHD, and almost inevitably you're going to come up with SNAP. Assessment tools for measuring loneliness, you're going to come up with the UCLA loneliness index. And like I said, there's a million of these. So before you start writing questions of your own, do see what's out there, right? I would say do see what's out there. Okay. Operational definition is a detailed description that defines a measure. Number of sandwiches, total number of items with something delicious between 2 slices of bread. I don't know why. That makes me kind of happy. Although not all sandwiches are delicious, frankly. That lobster sandwich does not look like it would be good. So does it count as a sandwich? I'm going to go with no. Just an unshelled lobster between 2 pieces of bread. In theory, the lobster could be delicious if properly prepared. Yeah, go ahead.
So if you were to use these like tool sets, say in like research, how would you tell someone or like the research board, like ethics board or whatever, like that you used another kind of like research question?
So you're not using another research
question, like tools for measurement.
I think you would just tell them, right? Like,
just like write it in like your proposal. And
yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay.
No, seriously, like a lot of these tools are like super well recognized too, right? And it'll actually lend you a measure of respectability in the sense that it's like, this is not someone who's going off and doesn't know what they're doing, right? They've thought about this. They've looked at what is the best in class or the industry standard for this evaluation, and then use that tool. So it's like, yeah, there's nothing wrong with saying, I'm going to use either the entire thing, say if you're doing like the loneliness index, or a subset of questions from the UCLA loneliness index to measure loneliness, right? No, I don't think there's any problem with doing that, right? Because again, a lot of these tools have been around and they've been refined so questions have been added, questions have been taken away for decades, right? And you're going to come up with better results doing that than say, how many nights do you spend alone a week, right? Which is not part of the UCLA index. Or do you often find, like I've seen people write all sorts of questions to try and judge loneliness that really are not well operationalized or things like this, right? Or any kind of thing. Like there's always better tools out there. And I would just say, do yourself a favor and look up the tools, because I will mark you better because you will have done better. Like the tool will be better. It'll make more sense. The questions won't be kind of random and ill-suited. I promise to give you examples. I should find some really bad ones. There are bad ones. And while I never disclose any personal information, I will take snapshots of it and send it to my one friend who is a survey nerd so she can laugh. Which I will never do to this class, but I've done in past classes. Only to the people who aren't here today. I'll say that. People who don't come to class get mocked. Okay. And then, again, don't be afraid of making mistakes. And I'll never make fun of you to your face. Only behind your back to my friends. Who also, spend time writing surveys as like part of their daily life. And you will never know. And so you will not be harmed. So this is all ethical. Okay, or maybe not, but it is fun. And I'll find some of the particularly egregious ones, and you'll see what I mean. Okay, so indicators. So indicators basically tell us, they indicate that there might be a link and indicate how strong that link might be, right? So basically, one indicator per concept is typically enough, although you might want more, right? So, if you're talking about, say, loneliness, and it's linked to age, right? You typically see like age goes up, loneliness goes up, right? And like the indicator is people spend less time with friends, right? As you know, this is well documented. As people kind of hit their 30s, they spend less and less time with friends until by the time you turn 70, you're spending almost no time with friends, right? So you might be like, yeah, loneliness increases as age increases, and the indicator we're measuring is time spent with friends, which is super low as you get older. Okay, it's advantageous to use more than one of a concept, right? Often done in survey research. That's why, like, in religiosity, right, you're looking at indicators: religious service attendance, frequency of prayer, self-identification of religion, importance of religion. There's other ones, and they're escaping my brain at the moment. Frequency of interaction with religious texts. Those would be all indicators, right, that you're kind of measuring. Okay. Yeah, so using multiple indicators, more than one variable to measure a concept, reduces the likelihood of misclassifying some people because of the language of a question is misunderstood, right? And this is, you never know whether your audience, right, the people you're, say, surveying, have a perfect understanding of what you're asking. And sometimes survey questions get misunderstood. We'll talk about how to avoid that when we talk about survey research. Simpler survey questions tend to be better, and like simple scales tend to be better for that. I will warn you in advance that if you write a survey question and each of the possible answers is like 2 to 3 sentences, you've gone badly awry. And people will be like, I don't understand what this question is asking, and either they'll answer it wrong or they'll quit your survey. And I have given the comment to students in assignments, like, on their 10 question survey that they give, I'm like, I quit this survey at question 5 because I didn't know what you were saying. I'm like, oh, these are too long. It's like each question is a page. I quit your survey and you get no data. Anyway, I never put it quite like that, but I'm like, probably you would have had a large number of people leave the survey at about this point, the point where patience wanes. Simple, like, you want more than, more indicators because less likely that people will misidentify things. Ensure the definition of the underlying concept is understood correctly, right? So more indicators, you'll get a better sense that you've got the right definition. Get access to a wider range of issues related to the concept, right? So by measuring, say, religiosity with multiple measures, you get a richer data set, right? And this, again, this is another thing that happens sometimes. I know I'm like freaking you all out now. I shouldn't talk about the assignments you haven't written yet. Sometimes research questions, especially that are like bi-factor, sleep on academic achievement. It's like, okay, I measured one thing, I measured the second thing. That's all I have. Those 2 measures. That can be a problem, right? You don't have other related issues. So sometimes, like, you'll see this as I get comments back to you. I'm like, you might want to broaden out your research question a bit. So you're measuring a few more things in a related kind of structure, right? So it's like, what affects academic achievement? Or what health measures affect academic achievement, rather than just like, how good sleep, how good grades, put it crudely. Again, this is experience, right? You don't want like just 2 simple measures. A, it's not a very rich research question. And B, you're not going to get a lot of usable data. The more kind of measures you have, right, or indicators you have, the richer the data set, right? And the more kind of you can play around with it statistically, the more you can say about that particular issue because you've got kind of just more stuff to say. Okay. Factor analysis. Yeah, the more stuff you have, you can do factor analysis, cluster analysis, regressions, right? Multivariate regressions, right, become more possible the more data you have, and then you can get richer kind of, richer kind of descriptions and richer things to say about your data. It helps weed out response sets. So a response set is when someone takes your survey and they just go through and they answer without reading the question, right? Or they answer all in the, let's just say you have a bunch of questions on a survey and it's all kind of Likert scales from like, strongly agree to strongly disagree. And someone doesn't really want to do it, but maybe, I don't know, you're an online platform and you're offering, a chance to win a vacation in the Bahamas. You got really rich research funders, so you could buy someone a ticket to the Bahamas in this fictional magical world. And someone's just like, I don't really want to do the survey, so they just go strongly agree for everything, and then they exit the survey, right? That's called a research set, a response set, where someone didn't actually do the survey. They just like bang, 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 bang through all the questions without thinking about them, and typically you just pull those out. The more factors you have, right, or the more indicators you have, the more likely you are to see that someone wasn't paying attention, right? If you just have two things, it could be hard to kind of weed out response sets. And so you can have data that gets really, really corrupted. And then ends up being kind of, what's the word? Useless. That clock is not at the right time. What's that? Okay. I'm like, it is not that time. You think a university this big could have functional clocks, but no.
Not at the morning.
What's that?
Not at the morning. They're all out of battery.
Oh, that's fun. Even for a couple of years, even the digital ones, none of that are plugged into the wall weren't working, but that's always fun. Like, can someone just come change the battery in the clock, please? Please. Okay, sorry, is that all making sense? Yes. And you said what? 17? Did you say 7? Oh, 13. Okay. You got a little bit of time. All right. Now we'll talk about Likert scales. Use them. They are annoying, but helpful. So a very common way of collecting data on people's opinions is to use what is called a Likert scale, or a Likert scale, depending on which pronunciation. I actually don't know which one is the correct one. But it is a really common survey tool. Why? Because it's very consistent, and also it's really easy for people to understand, right? So usually the respondent asks to give a level of agreement with a statement, or sometimes you'll get often, like some measure of often to some measure of never, right? So how often do you perform a particular task or behavior, right? Often to never. So the items must be statements, right? So here these are some of the questions I used, right, on my Catholic organization study. Catholic organizations that receive government funding should be allowed to provide services in ways that align with their faith-based values. Do you strongly agree with that? To strongly disagree, right? So you're making a statement, right? Bang. That's the statement. Do you agree or disagree? Okay, and you can see that for all of those questions. What is the last one? Catholic hospitals and healthcare facilities managed by Covenant Health. I give examples that receive government funds should be allowed to restrict services like abortion and medical assistance in dying based on their faith-based values. Strongly agree to strongly disagree, right? So a statement, right, has to be a statement. The options have to be interrelated. So you couldn't have strongly disagree, cat, dog, hamster, right? They all have to be kind of on a scale that makes sense. Or, strongly disagree to I don't like it, right? That wouldn't work on a Likert scale because and they're really easy to reproduce, right? So it's always a kind of scale. Now, the advantage of Likert scales is that it makes surveys really doable for people, right? Because all they have to read is this, right? This part. And then they know immediately how they're going to answer this part. And so you can ask decently complex questions here if you want. Although these are pretty straightforward. The reason they're useful is because once you get into, I know I'm talking about survey research, but here you go. Once you get into writing complex answers for each of these lines, even if it's short, but you have to read every single line in order to know what you want to answer, you almost always get people exiting surveys, right? Because people have limited time, people have limited attention, and they don't like you that much. They might like you okay, or they might be indifferent to you, but they're not going to give you 45 minutes of their time to answer a survey. So if it's like, this is a statement, you you ask a question and then you have a bunch of statements here, but they're each individual statements, almost you're going to have really high attrition rates to surveys, something like 70%. So Likert scales avoid that because you sort of make a statement and you judge, behavior, like many times a day to never, or many times a year to never, or, level of agreement with a particular statement. And so these kinds of scales are really useful for that, specifically because they make the answering part really simple. So when you're putting together a Likert scale, you can put together your own, although there's lots that exist already. Just remember, all the options have to be interrelated. It can't be, how likely are you to, you can ask, I am likely to attend events hosted by the University of Alberta, strongly agree to strongly disagree. Or you could ask a question like, how likely are you to attend, student-run events at the University of Alberta? Very likely, somewhat likely, neither likely nor unlikely, somewhat unlikely, or very unlikely. You could have that, but they have to be, you couldn't have strongly agree, strongly disagree, somewhat likely, somewhat unlikely, right? Because then it doesn't make sense. And again, you're going to get, A, your survey doesn't make sense, and B, people are going to quit on you. Okay, I think the folding up and putting on of headphones means I'm out of time. So let's leave it there. We'll start again with the Likert scales next time, and then we're going to talk about, we're going to keep going, and we should be in good shape. Oh, I got lots of slides left. Yeah, so by the time we finish Tuesday, we should have a good sense, and you should be well on your way to that second mini lab. Okay, we'll see you on Tuesday. Have a great weekend. All right. Hello.
Post the slides in PowerPoint, please.
Did I?
Only in PDF.
I thought maybe I had them open, so it didn't. Sometimes
It's hard for me to write notes on video.
Sure, I will. I thought I had, but like I said, I may have dragged them in.
Okay.
And because I had it open, I got an error and I didn't notice. So I will make sure I do. This class is kind of small, so like in some of the bigger classes, I still do, like social religion. I
Yeah, I
still
had it
do.
with you last year. So
Yeah, I just, it's such